Okay, well, we're picking up with natural theism today. First major heading in our discussion of the doctrine of God. And for a couple of classes, we're going to discuss these naturalistic theistic arguments. I think they're important because they're very reasonable, and even though unsaved people will not necessarily agree with it because their minds are warped and they can't think straight, that doesn't mean that they're not important or valuable. What's that? No. You got notes on it, so. And I want to give you a quiz on it, or at least questions to help you review it. Okay, I made up a quiz this morning. I just didn't have time to run it off. But the questions that I ask in that quiz should draw out for you the most important things in the chapter. So, all right. So, if you have your notes, there are about 10 pages in which he talks about the cosmological argument, and there are a few things that he talks about before by way of introduction. So he has about 6 points, I think, or 7 points in his introduction. The first thing you need to note is what theism means. We talked about this last class. Define theism. Define theism. Belief in God. All right? Simple. What is theism based on? Second point. Why would a person believe in God? Why do you believe in God? Reasonable. Secondly, why do you believe in God, Chris? Right. So, reason and revelation. Right. Is a belief in God limited to Christians? Can you give me an example of a person who isn't a Christian that can believe in God? Sure. Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Taoists, animists. That's right. Belief in God is almost universal in this world. And just because a person believes in God doesn't mean that it's the true God. Right? So theism itself isn't enough to cause you to be saved. But theism and the principles of it should lead you to... it's because of these things that we're discussing, in fact, that makes people idolaters. Really. Like, why are people Buddhists? And why are people animists? Why do some people worship the rocks and and all this stuff? Why are people into the occult? Because of these arguments. They don't necessarily work through them thought for thought, but the fundamental concepts are there. So we need to recognize that theism is not confined to Christianity. That's his third main point. Fourth main point that he made in his introduction is he says that there are some people that look in nature and come up with anti-God arguments. You need to realize that the theistic, the naturalistic, theistic arguments are opposed by the naturalistic, anti-theistic arguments. Do you have any idea what we mean by that? No, this doesn't prove God's existence. Right? It argues for God's existence. There are such things as the nature of the cosmos, the order and design and purpose that you see around you, man's nature, man's character, right? the very idea of God, which is the ontological argument. These are the naturalistic, theistic arguments that argue for God. All right? Now, there are things in nature that argue against God. What is the one you always hear about? People don't call it this, but basically they're using an anti-theistic, a natural anti-theistic argument, such as?
It's an anti-theistic theory, so you don't say it, then I'm not calling it like that. What do you want?
I'm asking you to think for yourself instead of trying to make. I'm not asking you.
For me, it's no God, it's natural. There's no need for God in evolution for me.
Why does it? Why would it, what I'm asking you is why would a person think that way then? Okay, so there is a natural bias then in the heart of man against God. And that's one of the things that leads a person. This opposes this. Right? Remember what we talked about yesterday, or in the last class, that intuition is one of our sources for knowing God. And Schaeffer said, he admitted it's nothing more really than a bias that God has planted in the heart of man. There's a famous person that has made a quote, something to the effect that that there is a God-created vacuum in the heart of every man that seeks after God. Right? That's intuition. Right? But then a depraved sinner's intuition is pretty small. And some people have a pretty heavy-duty bias. What if a person is demon-possessed? Right? Their natural bias is going to be totally against God. In fact, as Paul says in the book of Romans, nobody really seeks after God. Right?
I was wondering about that kind of business, really. I felt confused with believing that. I remember when you exercised how do you do it?
You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. God will.
I know. Like you just leave it and you walk away.
There's nothing you can do except pray. Right? So a person's natural bias against God is one of the things that would be on the anti. But I'm thinking of some very obvious things. Like, why are some people so embittered against the idea of God? Death. That's part of nature, isn't it? Right. Death, injustice. So we're talking about this again, the natural bias. They don't even want to think that there's a God because they don't want to have to give up their pleasures or yield to or submit to God. So that's one of the very strong things that's in the mind of man naturally that opposes the naturalistic theistic arguments. These are arguments against God. Right? Death, injustice, the dilemmas. If there is a good God, then why does He allow all this bad sin and suffering and sorrow in the world? Babies dying, starvation in Ethiopia and stuff. And that's something that people will throw in your face. That to them, they look around the world and they not only see the beauty and the design and the order, but they see the other as well. And it's the big problem. Right? You have to realize, and that's his fourth point in his introduction, is that there is a contrast between the anti-theistic arguments on the one hand and the theistic arguments from nature on the other. Now, Christians, of course, stress this. But there's no doubt that we do live in a cursed environment. And there are wolves and diseases and all that stuff just as real, if not more real, than the beauty. Okay? So you can't blame a person necessarily for throwing this out. They should, if they're going to be honest, they should say, yeah, I can see that all of this argues for God. But their natural response, you would expect them to say, but Because, let's face it, we can starve to death, we can freeze to death in a nice world that God has made if you're going to argue for God. You know, so we can't reconcile that. We've already touched on the two sources for your knowledge of God, nature and Scripture, and you can restate that in this way. He says in his introduction that there are two fields of theistic research: natural theism and biblical theism. So most of this course is going to focus on this field right here, right? Biblical theism. We're going to familiarize you with the Scriptures, right? But for a couple of days, we're going to focus on natural. What is the premise that Schaeffer states about the relationship between natural revelation and biblical revelation? What do you believe as a Christian about the two? What should you believe about how the Bible's message about God relates to nature's message about God? There's something fundamental that we assume. Well, okay, yeah, there's several things we assume. That's one, but there's one primary thing that we assume. Okay, we're assuming that God, right? Now can we just go one step further? Logically, if God did that, and if God made the world, and if God revealed the Scriptures, then that's the point. You know, that if they have the same source, they ought to be complementary, right? The message of nature isn't necessarily, how can nature's true message contradict what God has specially revealed in the Bible? They ought to fit hand in glove if God is the same source. What you were saying wasn't wrong, you were leading up to it. And so this is a kind of an important introductory point when you're talking about nature's arguments for the existence of God. We Christians assume that nature's message, but nature does have a message. I sometimes get the uncomfortable impression that some Christians have they've had such bad experiences in school and stuff with evolutionary teachers, and that they think that science is all bad. Right? No, science is not bad. It's what scientists with their false presuppositions do with science. They twist it to leave God out. But if God made the world and He told us to have dominion over it, science is a valid endeavor for Christians. We have a mandate to be scientists, right? But while we're scientists, we should realize that this is God's world, and it tells us God's message. And some of the greatest scientists have been, fundamental believers. The guy that, Newton and Faraday. Sure. Ken didn't hear that, but even Darwin at the end of his life. All right. One last thing that we need to point out from the introduction, actually there's two more things, is how far will naturalistic theism take you? How far will this information about God take you? And what can you know about? What's the scope? Yeah, pretty general. Specifically what? Right. God is great, and He's personal. Is personal. These arguments, the anthropological argument is what points to the personality of God. All right? All right? Great in power and wisdom. All right? Okay, so the naturalistic theistic arguments argue for these 3 points primarily. God's existence, the greatness of His attributes, and the personality of his person, of his character. Right? They can't tell you about Jesus Christ. Right? You can't see that in nature. All right. So the scope of naturalistic theism then is limited. It can, as Schaeffer says, it can teach you the existence and the personality and the wisdom and the power of God, but not the love and saving grace of God. Key point. Now the last thing in his introduction, before he discusses the cosmological argument, is that there are two types of arguments involved in naturalistic theism. And these three that we've listed on the board, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the anthropological argument, you should learn those names. Those three are based on what kind of reasoning? What is the Latin phrase? Right. A posteriori. Rear end arguments. After the fact. Alright? And the idea of God, the ontological argument, is based on a different kind of reasoning. The a priori. Now those two, if you're ever going to discuss this with somebody that's intelligent, that knows what he's thinking, that can discuss terminology, you need to know the difference between those two. Okay? And even if you don't remember those two words, and for this course, I think you should learn them. But even if you do forget them, remember the concept. Okay? A posteriori type of argument is reasoning from the effect back to the cause. In other words, I look around me and I see the evidence, and then I reason that because of this, then something must have caused it to happen. Right? So you're going from the rear end. Your posterior is your rear end. It's the after the fact. Okay, something comes before it. See? So you go from the end of the process back to the front of the process. Right? Here you're going from front to back. A priori, the prior. You're going from cause, you're reasoning that there is a cause to produce some kind of an effect. Now, have we lost anybody? Right? This is, like I said, you don't necessarily have to remember these terms, but get the idea. Almost all science, this is the scientific method, right here. This is the scientific method, where you make your observations. Observations are what? Are they causes or effects? Right. Now there's a mark on that wall over there. Right there. Okay? Just a little where it went now. But there's a mark on the wall over there. You see it? Now, if somebody was to walk in here, let's say it was dramatic. Say I threw a balloon full of chicken blood on the wall, all right? And there's blood all over the wall. Somebody walks in a half an hour after we've all left class, and he sees this on the wall. Right? The person's going to reason from the effect over there back to some kind of a cause. He's going to try to figure out what happened, right? This is normal. That's a posteriori reasoning. You look at what happened, and then you try to figure out what caused it to happen. See? Right. So we look around us in the world and we see the infinite design in the stellar arrangements and the planetary arrangements, all the orbits and the time, and just everything lines up. Then you can go into the macro biology or microbiology, and with an electron microscope and look at the intricate design of of a piece of dirt, of the elements, the compounds and stuff in nature, a leaf, right? And they all show design. Right? Now, if all that's there, that doesn't happen by accident normally. And so you reason backwards from since this is the way it is, then something of a certain quality and character must have happened, caused it to happen. So this must be such and such and such. Right? It's the scientific method. This is called inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. Inductive is you look at the particulars first, without setting up anything, and then you come to a general conclusion from particulars. A priori is deductive reasoning, that you go from a general assumption to specific cases. Right? You need to know the difference between those two. Now, let's talk about the cosmological argument in the last half of the class. You need to understand it. By the way, cosmological argument is mentioned in the Bible, and I was surprised that Schaeffer didn't give you these references. I don't think he did in the chapter. But the Apostle Paul himself uses there are two really good examples of the cosmological argument, or a posteriori reasoning. In the Bible. Do you know what they are? Do you know what the two examples are? There's one in the Old Testament, one in the New. That's a statement of there are probably others. The one I'm thinking of is David in Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God. In other words, nature and the heavens give to us a message. That's a pretty complex one to explain to people. Yeah. The heavens declare the glory of God. I'll just write that down so you can see it. The heavens declare God's glory. What you're doing is you're going from the effect, that which has been made or exists, the heavens. There's the effect. And they tell us, the effect tells us that there is a God of glory, a very powerful God. See that? And in the New Testament, the parallel passage is? Okay, that's an example on the negative side, right? That the groaning of nature argues that there is a curse, right? It goes back to that, right? What happened first? Creation of the curse. All right? So Romans 8 is a posteriori reasoning back to the curse, and Romans 1 is a posteriori reasoning back to creation. All right? Yeah, that's the other passage, Romans chapter 1. Let's read it. And if you don't get anything else out of the discussion today, remember this, Romans chapter 1 is probably the best example of the cosmological argument in the New Testament, or the Bible. God is angry, verse 18, in heaven against men who hold down the truth in unrighteousness or suppress the truth. Verse 18. Now we continue. Why is God angry? Because, in verse 19, that which may be known of God is manifest in them, that is, among the men. For God has shown it to them. He's shown himself what he's like. He explains further. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. See that? You can't get a much clearer statement of a posteriori reasoning, right? He refers to the creation of the world and manifest in them, that which is manifest, and that which is shown, and that which is clearly seen. What's that? Oh, we did it. Okay. Things that are made. Right? So he just uses several references back to the world. Right? Basically, we're looking at the world with all its myriad of effects. You know, what it is like. This is what we see around us. And Paul says you can know God from that. It goes back to the cause here. Right? That which may be known of God is manifest. God has shown it to them, right? Himself. The invisible things of Him are clearly seen. So the invisible things about God, clearly seen. And He specifies power and Godhead. See? Power and Godhead. Paul uses this argument from the effect back to the cause. Right? This is one of the reasons why creationist scientists generally win debates. The ICR guys, Blaine Gish and all those guys, they continually go around debating evolutionary scientists. Boy, the evolutionists have a tough time arguing that the present laws that we see in operation don't apply to origins. They apply to everything else in life, why not to origins? Cause and effect. They just really have a hard time squirming their way out of that. You nail them every time with this cosmological a posteriori type of reasoning. Right. Now, what is the point? Let's summarize it. This is the best example in the New Testament of the cosmological argument. What is the cosmological argument? State it, summarize it in one sentence. We'll give Blair the first opportunity. Tell us what the cosmological argument is. Or nature argues that that there is a God, but in terms of cause and effect. Okay. Nature argues that someone or thing brought it into existence. Yeah, started it. I can't make it much simpler than that. Right? Nature argues that someone or thing started nature itself. Right. It's one of the first law of thermodynamics is that matter and energy neither create themselves. Energy cannot be created or lost. It just changes form. And that matter cannot create itself. Those two things are bound up together in the same law. Okay? Yeah. Okay. As Schaeffer puts it here, he says the cosmological argument traces the cosmos back to its maker. It deduces evidence that God exists and is the first cause. The universe connotes an adequate cause. Now, he says historically there are 4 theories about where the material universe came from. Here are other ideas. Right? Other ideas. Only so many options. 1, matter is eternal. All right? And these first 3 ideas all have that one thing in common. That matter is eternal. That matter is eternal. The second one says, but even though matter is eternal, presently, but in the present, it can change itself. Right? And then similar to that is another view, ancient view, that matter is eternal, but at present, God changes it. God is the one that forms and fashions it. Right? Sort of like theistic evolution. And then the only alternative view to the fact that matter is eternal. If matter is not eternal, then what do you have to believe about matter? That it had a beginning, right? So matter is created. And which of these 4 views is the Christian view? Yeah, only this one is adequate. Okay. Now there's one or 2 basic premises to the cosmological argument. Yeah, he puts them in 3, but they all have one basic thing in common. Cosmological argument is based on one presupposition, one basic premise. Right. For every cause has an opposite and equal effect. And you can turn it around. Every effect has an opposite and equal cause. And everywhere around us in nature we see this. I think that's part of the first law, right? The second law has to do with entropy, that matter degenerates as whenever it changes state. That you observe always a downhill trend from order to disorder. Right?
Imitation, 99.9% of the time, imitation is negative.
But do you understand the significance of this premise? There is no such thing as a cosmological argument if this is not true. If there are examples of things happening, if anything has ever been brought into existence of its own self, then there's no such thing as cause and effect. It's not a universal law. Right? When you're talking about cause, Schaeffer points out, you have to mean something that is real and adequate and sufficient. Something that has real power, that really exists, and that is sufficient or adequate to bring something else into effect. For example, if you were to get in an airplane and fly over Arizona, there's a big hole in the ground, right, where a meteor hit it. Right? Now, something had to have been adequately big enough to make a hole that big. I mean, if you drop a pencil out of the plane, it isn't going to make a hole that big. The pencil isn't adequate. Right? The pencil will make a mark. Right? You can't wish a hole. A wish isn't real. In material terms, right? And so when you're defining cause, it has to be. It can't just be something that existed before. Your parents existed before I was born, but your parents are not the cause of me, right? I'm an effect, right? I mean, something caused me to happen, right? Right? But just because something else existed before I happened doesn't mean that it's necessarily the cause of me. So it's not, just because matter existed before, if you apply this argument, this point that he's making, just because something existed before doesn't mean that it's an adequate explanation for the way things are today. And that's what the creationist says to the evolutionist. Like matter, the existence of matter before isn't adequate to explain the way everything is today. It isn't. Right. So, when you're talking about cause, you're talking about something real and powerful. All right, let's go on. A couple other things about the cosmological argument. There are only two possible views regarding the existence of the universe. You're talking about the cosmos. There are only two possible views. And all of these views here illustrate the same thing. This is one view, and all of these are the other view. What are the two views? Either the cosmos is eternal, or it was created.
That's interesting too, because Buddhist culture understands God is eternal. And if you don't know it, that's the way it has to be. Otherwise, there's no explanation in what it says.
There's no adequate explanation. The adequacy is the key point. I think.
That's what Schaeffer that faith.
Yeah. Now he talks a little bit about the results of these two views. If you believe this explanation, which is a non-explanation, that matter is eternal and therefore the universe is eternal, I'm going to use the word cosmos. If you believe that the cosmos is eternal, what results from that? Yeah.
The atheists have a problem. I don't believe in God, you have a problem. It's,
Think in real practical terms. Do you know an atheist? When you think of a school teacher, somebody that you knew was an atheist, how does he live? How does he think? What are his values? All those things result from, ultimately, his belief that the cosmos has always existed, so therefore, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. You don't have to face God. Right? Yeah. Yet there's no purpose for being here. We're an accident, looking for some place to happen. You know, you are left devoid with an explanation of your past, your present, and your future. Right? What are the results of believing that the other view, that matter is created? That the cosmos has a specific beginning because there was a personal first cause. Sure. It gives you a moral foundation. It gives you an intellectual foundation, a reason for being, right? Moral limitations on your existence. Sure. Basically, it shows us that God is greater than man. What a person is forced to believe then, who believes this view that matter and the cosmos are eternal, that view not only leads you to a purposeless and meaningless existence, but it forces you to explain it in terms of chance, in terms of mere chance, or necessity, that it just had to happen this way. It had to be. There's no other possibility. Chance or necessity. Because if it was any different, then it wouldn't be necessary. Mindless reasoning. Schaeffer makes a very important point here, right at the conclusion of his study, that you need to, and you alluded to it once already today, Blair, and that is that the naturalistic theistic arguments do not prove God's existence. They do not prove God's existence. Make sure you don't fall into that trap whenever you're talking to somebody. You can't prove that God exists from nature. You can argue for his existence, but you can't prove it. To prove it, you have to bring God down and show a person face to face, here he is. And you can't do it. These naturalistic theistic arguments cannot bring you down a real God. But they argue for his existence. Yeah, we're done. That's it.